Hey, morning everyone. Thanks for coming. Early on a Saturday. It was a bit of a mission for me to get here or get up this morning, but really happy to be here. My name's Rex, and I'm an artist, and animator, and game maker. And sometimes I've worked in like larger studios, and sometimes on like really tiny projects. And most recently, I've been half of this little tiny game making studio called Foam Sword, which is like a collaboration between me and my friend Moo. And we first worked together at a studio called Media Molecule on a game called Little Big Planet, like sort of, I don't know, 10 years ago now. And, you know, we sort of split apart after that, did separate things, but we joined back together to make this new game called Knights and Bikes. And Moo works on the tech side of things, and I work on the like the art, animation, story, level design. Being such a tiny studio, you know, you have to wear lots of different hats, and yeah, that's what I've been doing. And we also collaborate with a couple of other guys, Kenny, who does the audio, and he worked on Little Big Planet and Tearaway with me, and then also a friend called Daniel, who is a composer. He sort of ended up being this big shot in Hollywood now, but he still remembers his old friends. He just did the movie Spider-Verse, which did really well. Really happy for him, and really happy that he still remembered his old friends and worked on our little tiny game with us. So, you know, I just wanted to like represent everyone who worked on the team. It's not just, you know, what I've done. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Knights and Bikes, because that's the thing I've been working on, and I can sort of, well, just talk about the most, and sort of how some of the pillars of the game have like influenced our thinking. But particularly I want to really talk about like sketchbooks and working on paper, and like just the design processes that I go through. So hopefully this won't be anything like just some, you know, sales pitch for the game, which is available now for a very reasonable £15, and it comes out next week on Switch. But anyway, moving on. A little bit of personal background. Maybe a strange start, but I started out as a sheep farmer, and I gradually raised a very quite a large flock of sheep. You know, sheep make more sheep, and that just kept on going. And then one day I sold them all, and I bought a computer. It's not actually me, despite what you might be thinking. It was a Amiga 500 computer. This is like ancient history now, but I just thought it was the best computer ever created. I think, and I think that's because it was like the first time that there was like an affordable computer that you could use creatively. It wasn't like some big like mainframe. It wasn't like, you know, the Apple Mac was at the time, but that was just sort of a very serious thing in studios. And this was like a computer for making playing games, but then it sort of, you could start to like pull the games apart and find out how they were made. And I used this amazing technology to make some really bad games. That's like one of the first games I ever made, and you know, you can't even really work out what's going on there. But it's like a top-down game, and there's some people, and they all walk around, and it's like having sort of a gang which you take around in some cyberpunk world, because this was the 90s and everything was about cyberpunk. So that's what I did. I think the reason that the games were bad was because I didn't really have anything to say with them at the time. I was just like a bit too in love with the technology, and I was kind of using it more as a tool. I wasn't using it as a tool with an end goal. You know, it was just like, I love computers, I love making video games, and I wasn't really sort of thinking, well, what can I actually do with this medium? And you know, the only statement I was really making is that I like games, I want to make games, which isn't necessarily that interesting to anyone else. It's a bit like sort of using a pencil to draw more pictures of pencils. You know, you're just sort of going round in a loop, never really breaking out of it. So luckily I went off to art college, discovered life, completely forgot about making games for several years, and I learned my most important lesson, that there will always be better artists than this guy. I should probably go down a little bit lower. And that was like a really harsh lesson to learn, but like a really important one. And you can say the same for any discipline, really. Art, design, music. And I learned that there will always be artists that are far more talented than me at drawing hands, definitely at drawing feet, and also drawing horses. But this like really freed me up to make work that was less about the rendering skill and more about finding like the best way to convey a message. And you know, I got very interested in just working in a very mixed media way and just pulling in like whatever was the best way to tell a particular story or give a certain emotion. And that sort of brought me more to making like game-like things using the internet and Flash, which got me a job firstly at Lionhead Studios, which is a really fantastic place to work. Lots of incredible talent and just the best training experience I could have, but not that visually experimental. And then I got an outlet for that by teaming up with these friends to take really awkward photos, but also to make games that, were kind of a bit more visually experimental and kind of looking for new ways to allow players to like almost collaborate with us and make a game, you know, using UGC and all of that kind of stuff. And this is the game we made, Little Big Planet. And it was a game that allowed people to make their own games. And to help that, the art style really needed to make players feel comfortable with making stuff. So like the art style became part of the game design, really. If you look at any video online showing behind the scenes of game development, there's always stuff like this that looks very technical. You know, there's lots of vertexes and modeling and, you know, all the hardest bits are the things that get shown. And we wanted to just sort of get back to like just treating it like, like a craft table. You know, it's just paper and scissors and glue, and just getting more playful and just experimental with it. And then after that, I worked on a project called Tearaway, which is the first time I'd led a team. And that was a really big learning process for me.
That was an awesome game. So
that's very kind.
So much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's cool. And I just, really wanted to make sure that the art style and the design were fully integrated. It wasn't like it wasn't like a sort of filter, the fact that it was all made out of paper. You can hopefully see it's a world made out of paper, which, could have just been a style choice. And it does look quite nice and it's easy to recognize. I think it's always nice to make a game that you can just tell what it is from a single screenshot, and to stand out. But really, the reason that we chose paper was because it's the first time that we'd made a game on a portable device. And it was on this thing called the PlayStation Vita. And the Vita was just like covered in inputs. You could touch the front, you could touch the back, this weird like touch screen on the back. And it felt that this console was almost made to make a very tactile experience. And it felt that if we made something out of paper, it would really respond to the way that you're holding it and the way that you're touching the screen, or the microphone picks up background sound, or we could use the cameras on the front to sort of mess with the game world. So, but it caused a bit of a problem on game design, because it created this very distinct limitation that if the whole world is made out of paper, then how does that, how do you do a lot of the classic things in game design? So for instance, a whole bunch of things just wouldn't work. Like, is your classic lava level. So many games have like a fiery environments, but if you have a fiery environment in a world made out of paper, it's going to look more like that. That's a bit of a problem. So, and it didn't really feel that, it just meant that, you can't have fire, you can't have water, it's just going to get soggy. You can't have any ice, no slippy, slidey ice levels. Also, no spike pits. Spikes made out of paper, you just crush them. So, it meant that we had to really rethink our design lexicon and get rid of any materials or physical properties that weren't papery. So, what did that kind of leave us with? It's kind of this big crisis moment of, what can we do? I mean, it will look nice, it will be responsive, but what's the level design? What's the sort of minute-to-minute play experience? And again, kind of a little bit like Little Big Planet, we looked to things outside of the digital world. Like take a step back from the computer and have a little look more at like real-world things. And the production team, they arranged to bring in, it was a genius move, bring in a pop-up book designer. And they gave us a day-long workshop, we learned how to do all of this stuff, and really got very, very hands-on with creating stuff with paper and doing stuff like this, like instantly started to unlock all of the level design ideas again, and we had like completely new ideas. Not things based on spike pits and lava levels, but to do with like how the world could transform and be transformed by the player. And that in turn inspired this concept video by one of the artists on the team, Men Lu. And this really brought everyone on the team back together again, so that it wasn't just like a pretty art style that was stopping gameplay, but it was, it wasn't stopping ideas, it was inspiring new ones. And everyone on the team could really jam together again. So there's another example of like trying to do this like holistic art and design with real world inspiration guiding it. So after making Tearaway, I wanted to take a bit of time out, work on something that was a bit smaller scale, more like a hobby, something that I could kind of do at home and like still like play with my cats and make a game at the same time, and get rid of all of the like commute and all the like logistics of going to a studio. And that project became Knights and Bikes, which is an action adventure about two girls cycling around an English island in the 1980s, looking for lost treasure, learning about life and friendship along the way. So I'm just going to play a little bit of a trailer, have a glass of water, just have a little look at that. I won't play it all. Anyway, that probably gives you enough of a flavour of the atmosphere and the like cooperation between the two characters. We really wanted to make a game that was something that friends could really play together. It didn't feel that there were so many games now where you get to sit next to each other on a couch and cooperate and kind of mess around. It's kind of similar in some ways to what we were trying to do with Little Big Planet, of like cooperate, but also be a little bit cheeky with it as well and mess with your friends at the same time. Boom. So, and just to like distill the game down, I think it's really good to always have like some very big pillars to build a game around. And those pillars were childhood, it's about some kids, friendship, how they get along, exploration, what world, what do they do together, and also about imagination. How do they add to that world? How is it sort of changed by their influence on the game? And the origins of this really were, well, we knew from the start that it was going to be a very small project. It was going to be quite personal, with just the two of us making it. It needed to be very easy to create the assets. Every project I've worked on before this has always had like a custom engine, like custom built for it, and that's kind of a fun thing to do. But there's no way on a team of two that we wanted to be like making our own engine. So for the first time ever, I kind of had an engine that could make any kind of game, like Unity, and that was kind of fun and interesting. We were going to fund it with crowdfunding. So we wanted to use, we needed to get people's attention very quickly. So we sort of based it slightly on the Goonies, the movie from the 80s, as like a way of just bringing people in very quickly, but then like turning it into our own experience. And we knew that it was going to be a game about childhood, adventure, imagination, and energy. But we needed to like figure out what's the world, there was going to be someone exploring it, and we needed to know what kind of world they would be in. So it's good to work with what you know when everything else on a project is unknown. So the game's quite directly based on where I grew up, down here in Cornwall. Oh no. You probably shouldn't look very closely at that map. And this is where I grew up. This is where I sold my sheep to get my sweet computer. And also, but Moo, my co-founder, he grew up just outside of LA, in Anaheim, which is where Disneyland is. So he got quite a lot of memories of growing up around theme parks. So sort of thinking of this kind of touristic kind of place it's got a lot of ancient history, but it's also got like the sort of modern commercialization of that, and that felt like a good setting that we could both collaborate on. So focusing on the Cornish influence, anyone been to Cornwall? Very good. It's a nice place. It's got very rugged environments and little fishing villages and ruins of old forts and castles. It's very famous for King Arthur and his big breakfast. It's a place of magic and fantasy, but it's also one of the poorest places in Europe. Which I was very keen that had an impact on the themes of the game. It's set in an area that was once industrial and now has to mostly rely on tourism. And that's the first. This is the first page of my sketchbook on the project. There's quite a few things that ended up in the game. But just sort of like trying to like figure out, thinking about characters and environments and things. And a sketchbook is where I always start. I just think sketchbooks are the best. I've always got one with me, and I think of them more as journals. Start this, yeah. Think of them more as like journals and a way to like externalize ideas, just like get them out. Not just ideas, but problems as well, so you can really look at them. And spending time with a sketchbook gives you a little bit of space away from the computer, which I think is really, really key as well. You know, it gives you a certain, like a different kind of idea than what you get on the computer. But then, of course, when you come on the computer, then that encourages a different style of ideas as well. So it's like a combination of the two. And, you know, I think it's just really important to do more thinking in paper so that then you can have more fun on the computer. You can sort of mess with the ideas and just see where they go in a sort of serendipitous way. So the little rules that I have when working in my design journals are firstly, like, write it all out. Get everything out of your head and down on the page. Writing it down really helps focus on the problem, helps you sleep at night when you close the book. Secondly, I like to really spend a lot of time on it. You know, writing all sorts of different fonts and presenting it nicely. Partly because that just makes it, you know, easier to understand when you refer to it again. But more importantly, I think if you spend more time like writing out a problem and colouring it in or doing doodles around it, you're kind of spending more time thinking about it. And although you might think that you're adding more detail than you need, it's also giving you more time to uncover like problems and solutions. And you know, it's kind of a bit of a trick, really. You know, you're thinking about the problem without thinking you are. You know, you're not going, how do I solve this? You're just doodling, really. But, you know, it's just sort of percolating through your mind as you do it. And for the same reason, I try to never use the flood fill tool in Photoshop, because I think just being able to like click and instantly fill a canvas, you haven't spent the time like just slowly colouring it in, thinking about what mark or what colour choice you're going to make next. I think, you know, it's really good sometimes to just do the boring bit so that you're processing that, you know, and getting ready for the next stage. So, you know, time saving isn't always a time saving. I think it's good to work out in the world, so you get influenced by things that you can't control. I think that's really great. You'll kind of overhear conversations that you don't always understand, or hear music that you don't recognize, you know, watch people that you've never met before, and all of those things can like really like generate new ideas. You know, they're not being served up by algorithms. They're just, you know, it's just stuff that's happening around you, and it's surprising. And finally, I think it's really good to read it back. You know, you don't have to solve everything on the page as you're writing it down. It's more of a process of documenting what's in your head and getting all those tangled thoughts out onto the page where you can see them. So, reading it back a day later, you might suddenly think of a solution or have an idea that builds on what you were expressing. And when you're all done and you've shipped your game, it's a really good way to like look back over a project and you know, take stock of what you learned and what mistakes you made. Okay, so back at our game, and in parallel to all those sketchbooks, we were putting together a world, and here's how some of those sketches, they're like, you know, got interpreted into a, it's quite dark on this screen, but hopefully you can make it out. You know, building up all of these sketches to create a kind of a harbour scene on this stormy little island based on Cornwall. Here's the same scene again, but in Unity, so you can see how spin the camera around and it all disappears because it's all just a bunch of flat 2D paintings. And it's quite a fast way to build up an environment. It's a very short pipeline, which is really important for just us being a team of two. I kind of wanted this style so that I could just essentially do concept art skip all of the stages in between and then just save it out straight into Unity and like not have any of the sort of modeling and texturing and all of that other stuff to have to work my way through. So here's an internal scene. This is like a bike shop. You can see some of the earlier sketches and some of the like details. Felt it was a bit too boxy to begin with, and because this is the place that the kids like come and upgrade their bike and buy new stuff, I kind of wanted it to have more of a temple feel, and the workbench being more like the altar. So it kind of got redesigned, and this is how it ended up. At the start of the project, we actually had a completely 2D camera with no perspective, but it was kind of similar to looking at a static screenshot. And one of the, like I was saying earlier, one of the pillars was exploration, and it didn't feel like you were ever uncovering anything. You were just, the only way things would be revealed is if they scrolled in left or right. You weren't sort of like digging around in the undergrowth and, having things like just appear in a more 3D environment. So we then switched to like a 3D camera, and that just meant, that really brought the world to life a lot more. Made it, things are getting revealed by camera zooming in and out, and things fading in, fading out, depending on where you are in the Z depth. So, getting a lot more surprises from the scenery, including little cats to pet. There's another video showing how it's all laid up. And, it's quite a painstaking process, but ultimately it's quite a relatively fast one if you're a tiny team. And although it's painstaking, I think you kind of need to bear in mind that this is mostly how I solve design problems. Ooh. Solved. Just delete or hide the worst thing on screen. That's what I do most of the time. Most of the time there's like a cool, beautiful little bush there, at the base of something. It's because there was some issue and I needed to cover it up. So, I think it's fine to make some shortcuts so that then you can spend more time elsewhere in the game. Just don't get lost in the weeds, basically. So that's a bit of world building process dealt with. I've got like a different version of this talk, which is more art-led. It's all about all the artistic influences and stuff, but you can probably find that online somewhere. But I was going to focus in a bit more on just like sketchbooks and design process for this talk. But the core thing for the thinking behind the art style is to it's created with the materials that the characters would use to tell you their story. It's about a pair of kids running around in a world. And I kind of wanted it to feel a bit like you're seeing it through their eyes. So it's kind of, it's documented using the materials that they would have to tell this story. So hopefully you kind of feel like their like physical energy and their mental imagination is like manifesting on the screen. So in other words, it's all a bit fuzzy, a little bit scribbly to represent that. A little bit like Tearaway with the whole paper thing. I wanted it to have quite a self-imposed limitation on it, so everything in the game is just painted with 2 brushes. Just this sort of soft one and this much harder edged one. And putting that limitation on just meant that everything was much more unified. You're painting all kinds of different items and characters and things, but it really kind of pulls it all together if you're just using these 2 brushes. A few examples there. Okay. Touch very briefly on animation. Everything in the world needs to also convey that energy of childhood as well. And the way that kids are like constantly shifting attention. So wherever possible, I try and redraw everything 3 times to give it like a stop motion look. Keeps everything moving on screen. And hopefully it sort of excites your eyes a little bit and suggests that there's no one set way of looking at stuff. Everything is sort of in play, like it's atoms, its molecules are all like, excited and moving around. Kind of like, the kid's imagination is, it's seeing things like in a certain way, but they're ready to change into another form at any point. There's the co-star Demelza. You can see some of the stop motion style on her. The animation is actually done on the characters. It's actually done in more like a bone skeleton system, but then I try and add like these stop motion elements to still keep it, feeling like it has been hand drawn rather than more like a sort of 3D mesh. And Demelza's hair is really key in that. Kind of wanted them to be almost like thought bubbles that are on either side of her head, and suggesting that her imagination is just like fizzing out of her head at all times, infecting the environment. And that animation style really helped capturing that wild abandonment that we wanted players to feel as they cycle down the side of a mountain, chaotic blurs of hair and teeth and wheels. It's kind of represented there. And that line boil style is also really useful, showing that the kid's imagination is like affecting and adding to the world. So here we've got this, they're at a scrapyard at the moment, and this is like a car crusher. You put it in, things go in, get crushed and pop out the other side. But by like drawing onto the landscape, we can turn it into like a dragon for them. And it became a really useful element in the game to show the juxtaposition of what's there and how they're seeing it. And that art style really helped with that as well. And bring out more of the characters' personalities. There's a moment where they're disagreeing and you're sort of seeing what they think of each other. So that's like a few examples of like very high level ways that we tried to hit the pillars of childhood, friendship, got them listed, there we go, childhood, friendship, exploration and imagination. And that really helped influence the creation of the little world that players would be exploring. You can see the map here with all the logos of the sort of various levels that you get to visit. So I'm just going to flip back for the final bit onto the design journals again. And I try and break this creation process down into maps, mechanics, and timelines with a bit of storyboarding as well. So, firstly, maps. I think, like most people, all my earliest level designs were, as a kid, like drawing islands, nearly always like shaped like a skull, and drawing all the lava and dragons and jungles and stuff, and kind of still doing that, but in my journals. And I try not to plan a level in a sketchbook and then move to the game editor and leave the journal behind, because working on paper is a really good companion to working in an editor. I think it's good to try and redraw what you've designed in editor back on paper from memory, and see what you missed and think about why you missed it. Might help edit or streamline the design. It's also an interesting experience to try redrawing your environments from the perspective of different characters that are going to move through that world. I was designing a theme park level. I was just trying to make sure that, if I was a theme park designer and I want families to come there, how is this theme park cool for babies, kids, teens, mum and dad, and granny and grandpa? How is it like a good day out for everyone? And I think sometimes layering over just different perspectives on the same environment is really useful. Mechanics, a bit less to say on this one, but I didn't want to leave it out. There's a lot more digital work in this area, lots of back and forth between myself and engineer Moo. But a sketchbook is still the quickest way, I think, to generate ideas. And with mechanics, I find it's best to move from the sketchbook to software very early, so you can collaborate and experiment, but then you can like return to paper when you want to like really expand out your idea set. So in this example, we had a very simple mechanic of like targets that you could hit, and that was all stuff done on the computer, but then it was interesting to just go back to the sketchbook and like just go really broad with like, well, what things can you hit? How can we like dress up targets and make them interesting and react in an interesting way? So it was just a way of very quickly going very broad, which you could never really do digitally without, you know, a lot of hard work. And then timelines, and I really like doing these. They're just really like little graphs of how a gameplay might feel in terms of like intensity or like the information density. Like, is the player getting really bombarded with stuff and just trying to plot it out? I mean, it's not in any way precise. You know, I don't actually have like mathematical data to drive these. I'm just sort of thinking, does it feel, you know, a bit harsh there, or that's kind of a gentle bit, and it's just useful as a, you know, very high level way of looking at a level, and also it kind of makes it easier to make edits because you're kind of looking more at like a graph and thinking about the overall experience rather than staring at the level or staring at the artwork and thinking, I put so much effort into that, you know, I can't cut that. Whereas you just look at a wobbly line and, you know, it's a lot easier to think, no, that whole section needs to go. And then storyboards. You know, sketchbook is obviously like the easiest way to plan out a title sequence or some boss battle or just major story beats or your release trailer, which I think, yeah, that's what that was. Yeah, that video you saw earlier. This is how it all existed before that. You know, just get it all down on the page. And I find it's, you know, it's just a very quick way to make an animatic as well by just pulling out your camera phone and just holding it up to the panels. Just a very, very quick way to just get a feel for timings before, you know, taking anything to like the software process. And then you can, you know, match it up with audio if you've got that playing in the background. And, you know, finally, audio is just a really big deal for me. And I find that when I'm working, whether it's on paper or in the editor, a lot of my influences come from audio. You know, it's great to investigate other visual styles, but sometimes I find that when you're, you know, building a whole world and you're very sort of wrapped up in it, it's quite distracting sometimes to see other artwork, you know, and feeling like, you know, getting back to that thing I was talking about earlier of, you know, recognizing you're not necessarily the world's best artist. It's kind of good to, I just find audio good because it's not really competing with what you're trying to do. It's like a completely different, you know, it's a very different influence. So, you know, I take a lot of influences from like spoken word radio, background conversations, working out in you know, cafes and what have you. Making custom playlists, you know, if you're making some like quite oppressive level, maybe, you know, making a music playlist that just puts you in the right space. You know, in-game ambiences, you can hear the game running in the background. It's kind of good once the game gets to a certain point, and it's got the audio pass to just kind of leave it running in the background and just, you know, absorb how the environment sounds. Audiobooks, very good. Also, like the biggest influence on me on the game, and particularly this environment, which is the harbour, is the poem Under Milk Wood by Dylan Thomas, narrated by Richard Burton. I'm just going to play a tiny bit of it, and hopefully you'll sort of see what I mean. That, you know, this was very inspirational to me. Well, let's just play it.
It is spring, moonless night in the small town, starless, vital black. The cobbled streets silent and the hunched quarters and rabbits moved living invisible down the slow black, slow black, fishing boat. The house is a bland of mold, pump and the town clock, the shops in mourning, the welfare hall and widow's weeds, and all the people of the loathed and dumbfounded town are sleeping now. Hush, the babies are sleeping.
Right, I'll stop there. But, there's just so much imagery, it just puts in your head, and it's not necessarily, it's not like doing a Google image search where you're just seeing, show me harbours, and you just look at the harbours and you draw what's there. It takes you to a very different place, and, I think that's a really good thing, not just for art, but any discipline, really, to just, take in some very different influences and get inspired in a completely different way. But gradually, as the project continues, all those extra audio influences kind of give way to the actual audio of the game, and that's a whole new well to draw on. And as I was saying earlier, we're very lucky to be working with a very old friend of ours, Kenny, who we worked with lots of other projects before. And Kenny really loves old sound equipment and creating ways of creating like a very warm and imperfect version of sound from previous eras, which really matched up with the kind of 1980s setting of the game. So I'm going to let Kenny just talk for a second about sound effects. And he likes doing this thing of recording them onto cassette tape and then taking those recordings and then putting them onto cassette tape again and doing it over and over and then putting it back into the game, so it creates this sort of warmer, imperfect sound. So let's let Kenny have a little chat for a second. Hopefully.
I don't know we have track is about all the audio throughout to the cassette tape, that wonderful steampunk technology we have. So for Daniel's music, I gave that a 5-star treatment, and I built that to a Type 4 metal cassette. And then with the sound, I was a little bit rougher, I built a much cheaper thing off eBay. And I decided 4 generations old, we bounced the tape 4 times to just really try munch the sound out of it. So here's an 80 comparison between the original, the pristine digital version of the trailer. And now the cassette tape version.
So I'll let you into a secret. I can't tell the difference. I really can't hear the difference at all. But I find that attention to detail quite inspiring, and I think it's it creates a different atmosphere, a different working environment. That Kenny's got all this tape lying around, and there's tape spewing all over the place, and even if it's not evident in the end result, I think it probably it being part of the creative process, it makes, it has an impact on the final game. And actually having all that tape around did end up inspiring like a little mini game where you end up, there's an old cassette tape and it's all unraveled, and the two of you have to like compete against each other to jam your fingers in and try and wind it up quicker. So, even the strangest sort of things that feel like a dead end can, sometimes they can like bring you back to like a new idea in the final game. So basically, doing strange things in the real world can inspire some fresh thoughts in the digital world. Whether that's working on paper or commissioning pop-up book designers to teach you their craft, or teaching game development to people that have never made a game before by sort of inspiring them to just use like the childhood materials that they used to have, or like messing around with old audio technology. They all create like unexpected outcomes that you might not arrive at just using software. So in summary, I'd say it's very good to look for inspiration away from the computer. Probably got that theme from me. Placing limitations can really help generate fresh ideas. Sketchbooks, create one style of idea, but digital tools create very different ideas, and sometimes it's just, it's getting the balance between those two. It's really good to write down all your thoughts. Even if you're not visual, it's good to get them out so that you can look back over them and process those ideas in the future or be inspired by them again. But remember to look back over your old notes. Taking inspiration from audio, and going back to my original, very early games that I was making as a kid. Being more than just a fan of the medium. What do you really want to do with it? Sorry, what do you really want to do with it? And I'm going to finish up by showing you an actual poster for a death metal festival with all of the bands and their logos. There they are. And I would say that when you're creating a game, try and be party canon. Be yourself, make interesting choices, enjoy what you do, soak up the world and subvert what's being overused, and be a party canon of this industry. Thanks very much.